Welcome to the Revenge Diary. You know that moment when your entire world shifts? When everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you crumbles in an instant. I'm Rachel, and I need to tell you about the day my husband saved our lives, and the day I discovered that the people I trusted most in this world were willing to sacrifice my children for money. This happened in August 2023, just south of the Canadian border on the Trans-Canada Highway. We were heading home to Minnesota after what was supposed to be a perfect family reunion. But what started as a weekend of campfires and s'mores turned into the most terrifying revelation of my life. And it all began with a simple car swap. But before we dive into this incredible story, I have a quick question for you. What's the most awkward family reunion moment you've ever experienced? Maybe it was finding out a cousin was dating your ex, or discovering your aunt's secret hobby collection. Drop your stories in the comments below. I love reading them. And if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for what happens next. Let me start at the beginning, because understanding where I came from is crucial to understanding why what happened hit me so hard. I grew up in a small town in northern Minnesota. The kind of place where winter lasts 6 months. Everyone knows your business before you do, and Friday night football games are the biggest social events of the year. My parents, Wayne and Denise, were what you'd call salt-of-the-earth people. Dad worked as a mechanic at the local garage, his hands permanently stained with motor oil and calluses. Mom bounced between part-time jobs, waitressing at the diner, cleaning houses, whatever brought in a few extra dollars. Money was always tight. I remember wearing hand-me-downs from my older sister Lisa, and my brother Kyle's shoes were held together with duct tape more often than not. But I thought that was just normal small-town life. Everyone struggled, right? Looking back now, there were signs I should have recognized. Strange people would stop by our house at odd hours, men in beat-up trucks who'd talk quietly with Dad on the front porch before slipping him envelopes. Mom would disappear for hours on what she called med runs, delivering prescriptions to elderly neighbors who couldn't drive. At least, that's what she told us. When I was 11, my Uncle Marv overdosed in our basement. I remember the chaos, the ambulance, the police, Mom crying and repeating over and over that he was just holding pills for a neighbor who never showed up. I was young enough to believe her. Young enough to think these were just unfortunate things that happened to unlucky families like ours. My brother Kyle got caught shoplifting when I was 12. Not candy or toys, but expensive electronics from the Radio Shack in the next town over. My sister Lisa ran away for a week when I was 16, only to come back with new clothes and a story about staying with a friend's family that never quite made sense. But through it all, my parents painted themselves as victims of circumstance. We were just struggling, just trying to get by, just doing whatever it took to survive. I believed them. When I finally escaped to college on a partial scholarship, I told myself I was leaving all that chaos behind. I studied hard, got my degree in education, and built a life that was everything my childhood wasn't: stable, predictable, safe. I met James during my senior year. He was finishing up his training with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, preparing for a post on the northern border. James was everything my family wasn't: calm, methodical, honest to his core. His job taught him to notice things others missed, to spot inconsistencies, to trust his instincts when something felt off. We married 2 years later, settled in a quiet neighborhood outside Duluth, and started our own family. Emma was born in 2015, Ben in 2018. James eventually transitioned from customs work to nursing. He said he wanted to help people heal instead of just catching the bad guys. I thought I'd successfully left my chaotic past behind. I thought my children would never have to experience the uncertainty and confusion I'd grown up with. I was wrong. In early 2023, my parents announced they were organizing a family reunion in Canada. It had been years since the whole extended family had gotten together. Cousins scattered across Minnesota and Ontario, aunts and uncles I barely remembered, the sprawling, complicated web of our family tree. "It'll be like old times," Mom said during one of our monthly phone calls. "Remember those camping trips when you were little, before everything got so complicated?" They'd rented cabins near Lake Nipigon, north of Thunder Bay. The Canadian side of the family would drive down, the American side would drive up. and we'd spend a long weekend fishing, grilling, and pretending we were still the close-knit family we'd never actually been. Despite my reservations, James encouraged me to go. "The kids should know their extended family," he said, "and maybe it'll be good for you to see that you've built something better." So in late August, we loaded up our silver Subaru Outback, the reliable family car we'd bought specifically for road trips like this, with camping gear, floaties for the kids, and enough snacks to feed a small army. Emma, 8 years old and endlessly curious, peppered us with questions about Canada. Ben, only 5, was just excited about the prospect of catching his first fish. The drive north was beautiful. Minnesota's forests gave way to Ontario's wilderness, and the kids pressed their faces to the windows, spotting moose and marveling at lakes that stretched to the horizon. For a few hours, I actually felt optimistic about the weekend ahead. When we arrived at the cluster of cabins on Lake Nipigon, it was like stepping into a memory I wasn't sure was real. There was my dad, grayer and more weathered than I remembered, grilling hot dogs over an open fire. My mom, bustling around arranging folding chairs and coolers of beer. Lisa and Kyle had both made the trip with their own kids, and for the first time in years, it actually felt like we might be a normal family. The weekend passed in a blur of fishing trips, campfire stories, and the kind of forced cheerfulness that comes with family reunions. Emma caught her first northern pike, and Ben spent hours collecting rocks along the shoreline. James seemed to relax for the first time in months, even joining in the late-night poker games with my dad and uncles. But there were moments, fleeting glimpses of the old patterns I remembered from childhood. Hushed conversations that stopped when I walked into a room. Phone calls my parents took away from the group, walking down to the water's edge to talk in private. Men I didn't recognize stopping by the cabins briefly, always when the kids were napping or occupied elsewhere. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my past had made me suspicious of normal interactions, that not every whispered conversation was sinister. I should have trusted my instincts. Sunday evening came too quickly. We were packing up to head home, the kids cranky and tired from 3 days of late bedtimes and too much sugar. Emma was whining about leaving her new cousins, and Ben had fallen asleep in a camping chair, still clutching the toy fishing rod my dad had bought him. That's when Dad made his offer. "Why don't you take our SUV back instead?" he said, gesturing toward their dark blue Ford Explorer parked near the main cabin. "It's got better air conditioning, more room in the back for the kids. Plus, look at all those coolers, they'll fit better in our cargo area." I hesitated. Our Subaru had served us well on countless road trips. I knew every quirk, every sound it made. But Mom chimed in before I could object. "The seats are so much more comfortable for long drives," she said, already transferring our coolers from our car to theirs. "And honestly, we're planning to drive through Minnesota later this week anyway. We can stop by your place, swap the cars back, and have dinner with you and the kids. It'll give us another chance to see Emma and Ben before school starts." It sounded reasonable, thoughtful even. The Explorer was newer than our Outback, with more space and better amenities. The kids were already climbing into the back seat, marveling at the DVD players built into the headrests. James looked at me, eyebrows raised in a silent question. I shrugged. What harm could it do? "Okay," I said, handing over our keys. "But drive carefully with our car. And don't forget to check the oil. It's been running a little rough lately." Dad laughed and clapped James on the shoulder. "Don't worry about your old Subaru. I've been working on cars longer than you've been alive." We finished transferring our belongings, buckled the kids into their car seats in the Explorer, and said our goodbyes. As we pulled away from the cabins, I watched my parents and entire family waving from the porch, my dad's arm around my mom's shoulders. They looked like any normal grandparents, sad to see their family leave after a wonderful weekend. I had no idea what we were really carrying in that car. Monday morning, August 28th, 2023. The date is burned into my memory. We'd been on the road for about 40 minutes, making good time toward the U.S. border crossing at Grand Portage. The kids were settled in the back with their tablets, and I was humming along to Taylor Swift on the radio, feeling oddly content despite the usual post-vacation melancholy. James was in the passenger seat, flipping through the glove compartment to make sure we had all our documents ready for the border crossing. Our passports, the car registration, insurance papers. the routine paperwork that came with international travel. That's when I noticed his demeanor shift. At first, it was subtle. He stopped humming along to the music. His movements became more deliberate, more focused. I glanced over and saw him examining something in his hands, a small plastic baggie I didn't recognize. "James," I said softly, not wanting to alarm the kids. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he carefully placed the baggie back where he'd found it and began systematically checking other compartments in the car. The center console, the door pockets. His face grew increasingly tense with each search. Then he leaned over and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "Pull over. Right now." The tone of his voice, calm but absolutely commanding, was one I recognized from his years in law enforcement. It was the voice he used in dangerous situations, when there was no room for questions or hesitation. "What's wrong?" I whispered back, already scanning the roadside for a place to stop. "Please," he said, his eyes now fixed on the rearview mirror. "Just trust me, pull over slowly, act normal." My heart began to race. I looked in the back seat. Emma was absorbed in a movie. Ben was dozing with his travel pillow. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to frighten them. I spotted a gravel turnout ahead and eased the SUV off the highway, my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. The moment we stopped, James was out of the car, moving to the rear of the vehicle. "Stay with the kids," he said quietly. "Keep them in the car." I watched through the rearview mirror as he opened the rear cargo area. He moved methodically, lifting the floor mat, checking the spare tire well, running his hands along the interior panels. Then he stopped, his body language shifting from search mode to something much more serious. He found something. James came back to the driver's side window, his face pale but controlled. "I need you to stay calm," he said, "but we have a very serious problem." He gestured for me to get out of the car, keeping his voice low so the kids couldn't hear. When I joined him at the back of the SUV, he showed me what he'd discovered. A hidden compartment beneath the cargo floor, and inside it, 5 vacuum-sealed packages wrapped in thick plastic and duct tape. "From my training," he said quietly, "I can tell you with absolute certainty what this is. The way it's packaged, the consistency visible through this small tear here, this is fentanyl. High-grade, professionally packaged fentanyl." I stared at the packages, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. "How much?" I whispered. "Enough to put us both in federal prison for 25 years to life," he said. "This isn't user-level stuff, Rachel. This is trafficking, international trafficking." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I looked back at the car, where my children were sitting innocently in their car seats, completely unaware that they were 2 feet away from enough drugs to destroy our entire family. "My parents," I said, the words barely audible. They put this in the car with our children." James nodded grimly. "We're going back to the cabin, right now." The drive back to Lake Nipigon was the longest 40 minutes of my life. We didn't speak. We didn't play music. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and my own thundering heartbeat. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at Emma and Ben, who were puzzled by our sudden return but too tired to ask many questions. How do you explain to an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old that their grandparents just tried to make them accessories to a federal crime? When we pulled up to the cabins, most of the extended family had already left. Only our Subaru Outback remained, parked next to the main cabin where they were probably cleaning up the remnants of the weekend. James and I looked at each other for a long moment. I could see the controlled fury in his eyes, not just at what my parents had done to us, but at what they'd done to our children. "Let me handle this," he said quietly. We walked into the cabin, where my parents were washing dishes and packing up the last of the supplies. They looked up with surprise when we entered. "Did you forget something?" Mom asked with a smile that now seemed sinister to me. James didn't waste time with pleasantries. He set one of the vacuum-sealed packages on the kitchen table with a dull thud. "You were going to use your own daughter and grandchildren as drug mules," he said, his voice deadly calm. The reaction was immediate and telling. My father's face went white, then red. My mother dropped the dish she was washing, and it shattered on the cabin floor. "I don't know what you're talking about," Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't," James said sharply. "I spent 7 years with Customs and Border Protection. I know exactly what this is, how it's packaged, and what it's worth. This is professional-grade fentanyl, and there are 4 more packages just like it hidden in your SUV. My mother began to cry, not the tears of someone who'd been falsely accused, but the tears of someone who'd been caught. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she sobbed. You weren't supposed to find it. No one checks family cars with kids. We needed the money, Rachel. You don't understand how desperate things have gotten. And there it was. The truth I'd been running from my entire adult life. This wasn't bad luck or poor choices. This was deliberate, calculated criminal activity, and they just tried to drag my children into it. You used us, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. You used your grandchildren as cover for drug trafficking. My father finally found his voice, but what came out was even worse than silence. You have a clean record, he said, as if he were explaining something obvious. James has a good job, you live in a nice neighborhood. No one would suspect a family car with kids coming back from a vacation. It was perfect. Perfect. He thought endangering his grandchildren was perfect. How long? I asked. How long have you been doing this? The look that passed between my parents told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't their first time. This wasn't even their second or third time. This was a system, a business, and they just tried to expand their operation to include their own family. We're leaving, I said quietly. Rachel, please, Mom started. No. We're taking our car and we're leaving. Right now. They started to protest, to make excuses, to beg for understanding. But James and I were already walking toward the door, back to our own vehicle to check every inch of it before we dared to cross the border with our children. James went over our Subaru like a man possessed. He checked the tire wells, the engine compartment, every panel and crevice where something could be hidden. He used tools from Dad's workbench to remove interior panels, examining spaces I didn't even know existed in our car. I sat with the kids on a picnic table outside the cabin, trying to keep them distracted while their father tore apart our vehicle looking for contraband. Emma kept asking why Daddy was fixing the car, and I kept making up explanations that sounded increasingly hollow. After 2 hours of intensive searching, James finally stood up, wiping grease from his hands. It's clean, he said. Whatever they were planning to do with our car, they didn't get the chance. I felt a wave of relief so intense it made me dizzy. At least our own vehicle was safe. At least we could go home without fear of being arrested at the border. But then James pulled out his phone and began taking pictures of their SUV, of the license plates, of the packages we'd found. Timestamp, location, everything documented. What are you doing? I asked. Evidence, he said simply, in case we need it. We loaded our children back into our own car and drove away from those cabins for the second time that day. As we pulled onto the main road, I looked back and saw my parents standing on the porch, watching us leave. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by what had been revealed. I didn't wave goodbye. The drive to the U.S. border at Grand Portage felt like the longest journey of my life, even though it only took about an hour. Every mile marker, every road sign felt significant. Would we make it across safely? Would there be additional complications we hadn't anticipated? James kept checking his mirrors, alert for any signs we might be followed. I kept glancing at the kids in the backseat, their innocent faces a stark reminder of what we'd almost lost. When we reached the border crossing, my heart was pounding so hard I was sure the customs officer would hear it. But our crossing was routine, uneventful. The officer checked our passports, asked about our visit to Canada, and waved us through with a smile. Enjoy the rest of your evening, he said cheerfully. If only he knew what we'd just escaped. As we drove through the darkness toward Duluth, I finally allowed myself to think about what had really happened. My parents, the people who'd raised me, who were supposed to protect their grandchildren above all else, had tried to use us as unwitting accomplices in a federal crime. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces of my childhood began to fall into place. Uncle Marv's overdose, the strange visitors, the supposed medical deliveries, the money that appeared and disappeared without explanation. We hadn't been an unlucky family struggling to get by. We'd been a criminal family, and I'd been too naive to see it. 3 days after we returned home to Duluth, my brother Kyle called. I was in the kitchen making dinner when my phone rang. The kids were in the living room watching cartoons, and James was at work at the hospital. For a moment, everything felt beautifully normal. Rachel, Kyle's voice was tense, urgent. They got caught. I knew immediately who he meant, but I asked anyway. Who? Mom and Dad. They tried to cross the border again with the drugs. They didn't make it past customs. They're being held. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, processing this information. After we'd caught them red-handed, after their plan had been exposed, they'd actually tried again. What happened? I asked. Same car, same route. But this time, they didn't have you guys as cover. Dad got flagged for additional inspection. Apparently, he had some kind of prior incident on file. They pulled the car apart and found everything. Everything. Same shipment. Another attempt to traffic drugs across international lines. Lisa's freaking out, Kyle continued. She wants to know if James can help. Pull some strings, talk to people he knows from his old job. Maybe get the charges reduced or something. The audacity of it took my breath away. After what they'd tried to do to us, to our children, my family still expected us to help them escape the consequences. No, I said simply. What do you mean no? Rachel, they could go to prison for decades. This is serious federal stuff. International trafficking charges. I said no, Kyle. There was a long pause, then. What the hell is wrong with you? This is our family. No, I said, standing up and walking to the window where I could see Emma and Ben playing in the backyard. This is my family right here. Mom and Dad made their choice when they put drugs in a car with my children. Kyle hung up on me. Over the next few weeks, the calls kept coming. Not just from Kyle, but from Lisa, from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, from people I barely remembered from the reunion. They all had the same message: family sticks together. Mom and Dad needed our help. James knew people in law enforcement who could make this go away. They were wrong on every count. Family doesn't stick together when some members use children as shields for criminal activity. Mom and Dad had made their choices and would face the consequences. And James's integrity as a former law enforcement officer meant he would never, under any circumstances, try to interfere with a legitimate federal investigation. But the pressure was relentless. Lisa showed up at our house one evening, tears streaming down her face, begging me to reconsider. They're old, Rachel, she said, sitting at my kitchen table. Prison will kill them. Can't you just write a character letter? Tell the judge they're good people who made a mistake? I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw something I'd been missing my entire life. She wasn't shocked by what our parents had done. She was upset that they'd been caught. Did you know? I asked quietly. Lisa's silence was answer enough. How long? I pressed. How long have you known what they were doing? It's not what you think, she said finally. They were just helping people. Moving medicine to people who needed it, but couldn't afford it through regular channels. It's not like they were dealing to kids or anything. The rationalization was breathtaking. Fentanyl, the drug that was killing people across the country by the thousands, was just medicine in Lisa's mind. Get out of my house, I said. Rachel, please. Get out. Now, after she left, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the family I thought I'd known and the family that actually existed. The two were nothing alike. My parents were denied bail. The judge ruled that they were a flight risk, given their connections in Canada and their demonstrated history of cross-border criminal activity. They would remain in federal custody until their trial. Months passed. Kyle and Lisa kept me updated on developments I didn't ask to hear about. Court dates that were postponed. Plea negotiations that went nowhere. A court-appointed lawyer who was overwhelmed and underprepared. In March 2024, they finally went to trial. The evidence against them was overwhelming, not just the drugs they'd been caught with, but financial records showing years of suspicious activity. Bank deposits that didn't match their legitimate income. Travel patterns that suggested regular cross-border runs. Phone records connecting them to known drug dealers on both sides of the border. The prosecution painted a picture of a sophisticated smuggling operation that had been going on for years. My parents weren't desperate people who'd made one bad choice. They were career criminals who'd gotten greedy and sloppy. They were both convicted on multiple federal charges: conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, international drug trafficking, and money laundering. Dad got 15 years. Mom got 12. Kyle called to tell me the verdict, his voice hollow with shock. 15 years, he said. Dad's 67 years old. He'll die in prison. I felt empty, not sad exactly, not relieved, just empty. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. I was sorry that it had come to this. Sorry that my children would grow up without grandparents on my side. Sorry that the people who'd raised me had turned out to be strangers. But I wasn't sorry that we'd stayed away. Wasn't sorry that we'd refused to help them escape justice. Wasn't sorry that we'd chosen our children's safety over family loyalty. It's been almost 2 years now since that weekend at Lake Nipigon. Emma is 10, Ben is 7, and they rarely ask about their maternal grandparents anymore. When they do, I tell them a version of the truth that a child can understand. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt the people they love, and when that happens, we have to protect ourselves. James saved us that day on the highway, not just from prison, but from willful blindness. From the kind of toxic family loyalty that puts silence above safety, that mistakes enabling for love. I think about the woman I was before that weekend. The woman who still believed her parents were basically good people who just had a run of bad luck. That woman was naive, but she was also hopeful. She believed that family meant something sacred, something worth protecting at all costs. I'm not that woman anymore. The woman I am now understands that biology doesn't create obligation, that the people who share your DNA aren't automatically entitled to your trust, your loyalty, or your silence. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your children is to cut them off from people who would harm them. We've built a good life here in Duluth. James loves his work at the hospital, helping people heal from trauma and illness. Emma is thriving in 5th grade, making friends, and discovering that she has a talent for mathematics. Ben is in kindergarten, still collecting rocks but now also fascinated by dinosaurs. Our Subaru is still running strong, carrying us on weekend trips to Lake Superior, to state parks, to visit James's family in Wisconsin. People who love our children without conditions, without hidden agendas, without asking them to be anything other than what they are. Sometimes when I drive, I remember the spot on Highway 61 where James told me to pull over that day. It's just a gravel turnout next to the forest, unremarkable in every way. But for me, it's the place where my old life ended and my real life began. People ask me sometimes if I regret cutting ties with my family, if I feel guilty about abandoning them when they needed help the most, if I worry about Emma and Ben growing up without knowing that side of their heritage. The answer is no. I don't regret protecting my children from people who saw them as tools to be used. I don't feel guilty about refusing to enable criminal behavior. And I don't worry about my kids missing out on a heritage of deception and exploitation. What I've learned is that family isn't defined by shared DNA or childhood memories or even love. Family is defined by trust, by safety, by the people who would protect you rather than use you. My parents had a choice that weekend. They could have chosen their grandchildren's safety over their criminal enterprise. They could have chosen love over money. They could have chosen to be the people I'd always believed them to be. Instead, they chose to put 5 packages of fentanyl in a car with 2 innocent children, gambling with our freedom, our future, and our lives for what was probably a few $1,000s in profit. That choice revealed everything I needed to know about who they really were. James and I made a different choice. We chose our children over criminal loyalty. We chose truth over family mythology. We chose to break a cycle that had been going on for generations, even though it meant losing the only family I'd ever known. It was the right choice. Emma and Ben will never know the chaos and fear I grew up with. They'll never have to wonder if the adults in their lives are telling them the truth. They'll never have to choose between family loyalty and their own safety. They'll grow up knowing that the people who love them actually protect them. That trust isn't just a word, but a promise that's kept every single day. That family is something you build, not something you're born into. And maybe someday, when they're old enough to understand, I'll tell them the whole story. I'll tell them about the grandparents they never really knew, and the choice we made to put their safety first. I'll tell them about the day their father saved our lives by trusting his instincts and refusing to stay silent. Most importantly, I'll tell them that love isn't about accepting harmful behavior from people who share your blood. Love is about creating boundaries that keep the people you care about safe. Love is about choosing courage over comfort, truth over tradition, protection over loyalty. That's the kind of family we are now, the kind of family we've chosen to be, and I've never looked back. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button. And don't forget to share this video and subscribe if you haven't already. We've got more incredible revenge stories coming your way. Now I'm curious, have you ever had to make a tough choice between family loyalty and doing what's right? What would you have done in Rachel's situation? Let me know in the comments below. If this story affected you, please remember that family loyalty should never come at the cost of safety, especially for children. Trust your instincts, protect the innocent, and remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away.